All right. I hope everybody had a chance to grab some coffee and get relaxed, ready to hear from our main speaker. So I'll just give a very quick, brief introduction to Dave Goulson, and then I'll let him take over for everyone else. And so it's really my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Dave Goulson. He's a professor of biology at the University of Sussex who studies bee ecology and has published hundreds of articles on the ecology and conservation of bumblebees and other insects. He's also the author of both scientific and many popular books about bumblebees, and also founder of the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, which in combination I really see as a commitment not only to increasing the accessibility of his research, but really to emphasize his passion of pollinators and their conservation. And so as an award-winning ecologist and author, I think Dave is perfectly suited to discuss here the importance of pollinators and their conservation. And I'm so happy to be able to introduce him today. So everybody, please welcome Dr. Dave Goulson.
Thank you, Adrian, for the kind words and for your own tour, which is fascinating. I was feeling a bit inadequate at the 1,000 bees you have in Colorado. We only have about 260 in the whole of the UK. So there you go. It's a weird time, isn't it? I sometimes think the UK and the US have entered into some bizarre competition to see who can make the biggest mess of their country. And I thought we were winning with Brexit and Boris, but it seems you might have taken a lead in the last few weeks and months. But anyway, fingers crossed things go well in the next few days over there. Right, so I'm supposed to be talking not so much about pollinators specifically, but about insects more generally. I love pollinators. I've been studying pollinators all my life, but I almost think they get too much attention relative to the rest of the insects. And they are all in trouble, as we shall see. So just bear with me while I attempt to share my screen. This is a bit of a moment of truth because sometimes this goes wrong, but it looks like it's all working. Just let me go on to, there we go, perfect. So I've been fascinated by insects all my life. I went through a kind of bug phase when I was 4 or 5 years old, and I'm still in it. I remember collecting caterpillars from the playground. I found these just on the edge of the playground. There were some weeds and there were these little yellow and black caterpillars, and I put them in my lunchbox and took them home and fed them and reared them, and they eventually turned into the beautiful little red and black moths, and I just thought that was amazing, magic. And I've been fascinated ever since, and I've been lucky to make a career out of studying insects. This is my youngest son, Seth, and he's in his bug phase still. He's 10 now, but he's absolutely fascinated by insects. This is his pet cockchafer, Colin, sadly no longer with us, but anyway. And I think most people go through a bug phase. E.O. Wilson went through a bug phase. But sadly, most people grow out of it. And by the time they're teenagers or adults, their reaction to insects buzzing past them is to swat them. They wave their arms around in fear. They think this mysterious monster is going to sting them or bite them or give them a disease or something. And I think that's really sad. And we need to somehow persuade people to love insects, or at the very least to respect insects for the amazing stuff that they do. But before I talk about that, and sorry, I'm going to go even bigger for a minute, and just give some preamble, which I think is important to keep in the back of our minds. You know, this is obviously our planet, this astonishing, beautiful, unique rock hurtling through space with 5 or 10 million species clinging to its surface. We don't know how many yet. We never will. And it gives us, it's our home. It's all we have. We're not going to go and live on Mars. So at least not for the next several hundred years. And we really ought to look after it. And we're not, as you know, we're making a terrible mess. Climate change is the most famous of these issues, but there are many other huge environmental problems that we're creating. Soil erosion, pollution of rivers, soils, seas, the air, depleting aquifers, still, you know, images on the news of the Amazon burning and so on and so on. My real interest is in biodiversity loss and conservation, but particularly from an insect perspective. Of course, the general public, when they think of biodiversity and losses and extinctions tend to focus on mammals and birds, big charismatic creatures. Insects don't get much attention generally, and they should, because as I'll explain in a minute, and as I'm sure you know, they're enormously important. And the evidence is that they are declining just as rapidly as larger creatures. And you know, the big picture is we are now in the 6th mass extinction event. Species are going extinct faster than they have for 65 million years, since the dinosaurs were wiped out by a meteor. But this time, it's the first mass extinction event in Earth's history that's been caused by one species on the planet. And of course, that species is us. So insect declines really came to the fore about 3 years ago when a paper was published from Germany based on Malaise trap catches of flying insects. So that's a Malaise trap, top right. So it looks a bit like a tent. And it catches any type of flying insect, and they fall into a bottle of alcohol. And the scientists in Germany have been putting these Malaise traps out all over the country on nature reserves since the late 1980s. And this graph shows you the biomass of insects caught per trap per day from 1989 to 2016. And you can see it fell. It actually fell on average by 76% in those 26 years, which is pretty terrifying. I mean, that's, you know, roughly half my lifetime. 3/4 of the insects in Germany seem to have disappeared. And it isn't just Germany that this is happening in. As far as we can tell, and I should say we don't have much data from many of the tropical parts of the world, but we have lots of data from Europe and North America. And it seems to be that these declines of insects are very widespread and very rapid. I could show you lots more similar graphs, but I'll spare you the depression of doing so because it's pretty bleak reading. Take it as read. Insects, sadly, overwhelmingly are in decline. And as E.O. Wilson said, this is catastrophic for our planet. I won't read out this quote from him, it's probably familiar to most of you, but he basically said if people were to disappear, the planet would be just fine. In fact, it would recover wonderfully without us. But if insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. And he was correct. I just want to whiz through why insects are so important. So they make up the bulk of biodiversity. About we've so far named about 1.5 million species on our planet, of which about 1 million are insects. So they make up 2/3 of known biodiversity. So we know that roughly, or at least it's been estimated, that maybe one species an hour is going extinct right now. And that means that 2 out of every 3 hours, we're losing 2 species of insect, very roughly. Depressing thought. But as well as making up the bulk of biodiversity themselves, they're food for an enormous number of other creatures. Most species of birds, bats, many reptiles, amphibians, freshwater fish, all depend on insects. So if the insects go, if you're, for example, one of these beautiful bee eaters living in Germany, then 3/4 of your food supply has disappeared in the last 26 years. But insects do many, many other things too. They're involved in almost every ecological process you can think of on land. They're vitally important biocontrol agents. They're intimately involved in all sorts of nutrient cycles, recycling dung, dead bodies, dead wood, leaves. They keep the soil healthy, and so on and so on. And many of these insects are kind of forgotten heroes. People don't know much about them. They might hear about bees, but they would rarely hear about, for example, this beast. This is a lacewing larvae. Fascinating, perhaps slightly repulsive little creature. I think it's gorgeous, actually. It looks so strange because, well, so lacewing larvae are important biocontrol agents. They eat aphids on our crops. And this particular species, so it stabs the aphids with those jaws you can see, bottom left. And it sucks the fluids out of the aphid, and then it sticks the dried husk on its back. And that's why it looks so strange. It's covered in the remains of its prey. And we don't know why they do it. I guess it's kind of camouflage or disguise or something. But fascinating, rather magnificent little tiny creatures. And then there's the earwig, not many people's favorite creature, it must be said, but they're really fascinating, and it turns out to be important insects. So earwigs are actually important biocontrol agents, again, of aphids and other small insects, particularly on fruit trees. Earwigs used to be treated as pests. It was common for farmers to spray to kill them, particularly again in fruit orchards, because they sometimes nibble bruised fruit and nibble blossom. But actually they're much more important as biocontrol agents, and a good population of earwigs in an orchard can control as many aphids as 3 rounds of pesticide, of insecticide applications. They're also really cool because they show parental care. This is a mother with her offspring, which she guards lovingly and defends against predators until they're about half grown, and then she shoos them out of her nest. And if they refuse to go at that point, she eats them. So she's not the perfect mother, but nonetheless, rather fascinating little creatures, and we should cherish them. Of course, the thing that insects do best, this is a pollinator summit, you're all aware of this, is they pollinate. And as Adrian's already said, it's not just bees that pollinate. There's an enormous diversity of insect pollinators. Flies are particularly important, but then also beetles, wasps, butterflies, moths, and so on and so on. Bees get the bulk of attention, and they are often the more important pollinators, but not always. Depends on the plant. But bees are specialists in visiting flowers because, unlike the other insects, they feed their offspring on pollen and nectar as well as eating it themselves as adults. And they have a number of adaptations making them very good at that, including branched hairs, which help to catch the pollen. And you can see how effective that is. This bee can barely fly. It's caught so much pollen. Anyway, of course, you're aware that pollination is a vital ecosystem service. 87% of wild plants need pollinating by some kind of animal. It might be a bat or a hummingbird, but usually it's an insect of one type or another. So the very large majority of plant species on Earth depend upon pollination, as do, these are very well practiced statistics you'll have heard before, roughly 3/4 of the crops we grow in the world, the different crop varieties, everything from apples to pumpkins to tomatoes and chili peppers to coffee and chocolate, all depend upon insect pollination to varying degrees. So if we didn't have pollinators, our supermarkets would look much less attractive. The shelves would be bare because we wouldn't have most of the fruit and veg that we need to keep us alive. We literally couldn't feed the global population without pollinators. Billions or millions of people would certainly starve. So we should of course look after them. We should avoid ending up like these people in southwest China. You've probably seen these pictures before, but I think they're worth looking at over and over again because there's something very chilling going on here. These people are hand pollinating their apple and pear trees because there are no pollinators left to do it for them. And it's hard to imagine farmers in Europe or the US doing this or it ever being cost effective. So we need to make sure we look after our pollinators. Unless we go down this route, and I've joked about this before, but this is something that is taken seriously. There are a number of labs around the world building robots to replace bees, robo-bees, drones, whatever you want to call them. And it must be a kind of a fascinating exercise if you're a robotics engineer to see if you can produce a little drone that can effectively pollinate flowers. Or the one on the right there is actually a Japanese research group trying to produce drones that blast out bubbles which have pollen mixed into the bubble mix, and they land on the flowers with luck and pollinate them. Anyway, I kind of think this is a bit nuts. If you think of the resources, the plastics and metals and energy required to build and fly a fleet of, you would need billions of these little robots to replace pollinating insects, perhaps trillions. and they would break down and need repairing and litter the countryside, or worst case scenario, Vladimir Putin's computer hackers would break into the Bee-bot control system and turn them against us. Seems like a bad idea when we've got real bees that have been pollinating for 120 million years. They're really good at it. They're biodegradable, self-replicating, carbon neutral. They seem to have all the properties we would want in a pollinator. Do we really think we can build something better? Seems nuts to me. So let's look after bees and other insects. And to do that, we need to first understand why they're declining in the first place. And that's not simple. There are actually lots of drivers of insect declines. Loss of habitat globally is, of course, the biggest driver of biodiversity loss generally. Pesticides I'll say a little bit more about too. But there are a whole bunch of other stressors affecting insects. Foreign diseases, particularly affecting pollinators. We've accidentally moved bee diseases around the world, and many of them affect not just wild bees, but also other wild pollinators. Climate change is starting to kick in, probably not had a massive effect yet, but if it continues as projected, it's going to be devastating for wild insects into the future. Fertilizers create their own problems, which I won't talk about. Light pollution, there's some evidence that that's impacting on nocturnal insects, and so on and so on. There's a whole blizzard of pressures in the modern world on our poor insects. I'll say a bit more about the first two, habitat and pesticides. So we've lost many of the more flower-rich and hospitable habitats that we used to have, that pollinators used to thrive in, and other insects too. So for example, in the UK, we used to have lots of flower-rich grasslands. In fact, 100 years ago, we had about 7 million hectares, which for a small country, it was a big proportion of the landscape was basically covered in flowers, which would have been teeming with insect life. But we lost 97% of this habitat in the 20th century, replacing it with monocultures of crops or seeded pastures which are devoid of flowers, essentially. Landscapes that can support almost zero biodiversity. We've also simplified the global landscape. As we've converted land to farmland and then made small fields into bigger fields as time has gone on. And this is a really interesting sequence of aerial photographs taken of a small part of Western France. Top left, that photograph was taken from an aeroplane in 1958, and then it's exactly the same place, photographed 3 subsequent times through to 2010, bottom right. And it's quite dramatic how the landscape has changed. A landscape that used to be a higgledy-piggledy mix of little tiny fields with lots of different crops is now a sort of bleak, monotonous landscape with few crops. And it's kind of intuitively obvious why, from an insect's perspective, that's not a positive move. Of course, in the US, you like to go one better, and you do this on a much bigger scale than we do. Creating landscapes which are designed to feed people, I guess, or perhaps actually designed to make a profit, but terrible for biodiversity. So the second thing on my list of drivers of insect declines was pesticides. And this is a complex topic that I could talk about for ages, but I'll spare you. But very briefly, modern farming, this industrial model of farming that we've devised, is dependent upon large numbers of pesticide inputs. I've studied this in the UK and its impact on bumblebees. And so I have facts and figures here where, for example, on average, each arable field is treated just over 17 times a year with different pesticides. They might be insecticides, fungicides, molluscicides, herbicides, all designed to kill something and designed to basically maintain a system where there is no life apart from the crop. Of course, terrible for biodiversity by definition. Now, in Europe, there are about 500 different pesticides licensed for use by farmers. In the US, you are much more relaxed. You allow the use of a lot of pesticides that we've banned. You have about 900, nearly twice as many available to your farmers to blitz their farms with if they see fit. And that obviously has a big impact on insects and wildlife generally. So that's enough on the causes of declines. I don't want to depress you too much. Let's turn to the flip side. Let's be positive. What can we do about this? Well, the good news is there's lots we can do. Most insects haven't gone extinct yet, and they can breed really fast and they can recover really quickly if we just provide the right conditions for that. And insects live all around us, so we can personally get involved in doing things to help them. So for example, if we have any kind of garden or outdoor space under our control, we can make it insect friendly and do our bit for insect conservation. And it's really rewarding, because if you plant a few flowers for bees, for example, it really works. Within hours, you see insects arriving, and you know that you're doing something at least to help. And that's different to many of these big conservation issues: the rainforests burning, the ice caps melting, the polar bears having nowhere to go, and so on. You feel completely helpless. But with insects, you shouldn't, because you can get involved in doing something. And I think actually there's a huge opportunity to turn our backyards, our villages, our towns, our cities into a network of insect reserves. There's an enormous area of gardens. Again, I only have UK figures to hand, apologies for that, but in the UK there are 22 million gardens, covering about 500,000 hectares. And just imagine, that's a bigger area than all of our nature reserves. Just imagine if they were all full of insect-friendly flowers, not being sprayed with pesticides and so on and so on. Talk more about those things in a minute. That would be an amazing network of habitat, and it could be filled out by changing the way we manage city parks, road verges, roundabouts, cemeteries, and so on and so on. Which I think is an amazing opportunity, and also a great way to engage people with conservation, with insects, so that kids grow up in cities teeming with life. I think that's something really exciting we can all take part in. And I got so excited I wrote a book about it, The Garden Jungle, but sadly not published in the United States, but I believe you can get it from online suppliers of various brands, the usual suspects. Anyway, I'll stop trying to plug my own book. And let me run through quickly some of the things we might do in our yards to make them more insect friendly. So to start off, most gardens have a lawn, and many people are slightly obsessed with their lawns. They mow them over and over again. They spend an awful lot of time and petrol on doing so. Trying to recreate a kind of Wimbledon tennis court in their back garden or something like that. I don't really know what their goal is. But if you just stop cutting quite so often, most lawns are full of flowers. Certainly, it will depend where you are in the United States in particular. So this is my lawn, and I haven't planted any flowers into it at all. I just don't mow it very much. And it's full of flowers and insect life all through the summer, much better than a sterile mown lawn. And ideally, I try to persuade people to leave at least some of their lawn uncut all year and just give it an annual cut, replicating the management of an old hay meadow, if you have space. And just so we can do this with privately owned lawns, we can also do things like this with amenity grasslands. If you drive around most cities, you will see mown areas of grass, road verges, roundabouts, and so on, which seem to be mown for no great purpose. Mown grass supports very little life. And look what it can be turned into. So this photo was taken in Stirling in Scotland, which is a small city I used to live in. And there's a local conservation group. They call themselves On the Verge. That's their little sign at the bottom there. And they spend their weekends with permission digging over any bit of mown grass owned by the local council, digging it over and sowing it with wildflower seeds. And they've so far adopted about 93 different patches like this. You can see on the other side of the road, the kind of mown grass, what it used to look like. And these patches, I had a student counting insects in these patches, and compared to the mown grass they replaced, they have many, many times more insects, of course, as you would expect. You only have to look at it to see that it's a vast improvement for insects. So there's a road verge, there's a roundabout. Wouldn't it be great if every roundabout looked like that, rather than being regularly mown grass? A related matter, I try to persuade people, and this is a more perhaps controversial strategy, but that we should be more tolerant where we can of weeds. So many plants are regarded as unwelcome, and perhaps some of them for good reason, but many of them, it seems, a slightly arbitrary decision. Or, you know, what is a weed? At the end of the day, that a weed is a figment of our imagination. It's a concept we've invented for a plant that's, we think, in the wrong place. But many plants that are regarded as undesirables, that people spend a lot of effort trying to eradicate, are native plants that are very good for native insects. So again, forgive me for seeing this from a UK perspective, but these 3 plant species are all native to the UK, widely persecuted as being noxious weeds, but actually fantastic resources for pollinators. I actually grow all of these in my garden, and I'm happy to see them grow. My neighbours haven't yet complained of them seeding themselves into their garden. All is well, and my insects are happy as a result. So you can get rid of all the weeds in your garden just like that, just by renaming them wildflowers. And so relating to that, we should really stop doing things like this. So this is a very familiar sight in many cities around the world. This was a little bit of vegetation that was trying to grow on a tiny square of land around a tree on a pavement, and it's been sprayed with herbicide, probably glyphosate. It's usually the herbicide of choice. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole glyphosate saga, but suffice to say there are significant concerns about the safety of this chemical for the environment, for bees and for humans. And yet we spray it more than any other chemical in the world. We spray it when we don't need to spray it. What harm was that little bit of vegetation doing? It might have supported a few insects, a few flowers. But we killed it because we thought it looked untidy. Well, actually, I think it looks much more untidy now it's all dead than it did when it was green and alive. And we just don't need to do this kind of thing. It's utterly senseless. And in fact, I would argue that we should ban pesticides for use by gardeners entirely. France has already done this, so it's not impossible. In fact, I don't think you need pesticides for gardening at all. You know, it's a different matter if you're a farmer. You can make a strong case that pesticides might be necessary in food production by farmers. I would disagree with that too, actually. But in a garden context, there is just no justification for using poisons where your kids play, where your dogs and cats and whatever play. It seems absolutely nuts to me. And it really isn't necessary. I'm a keen gardener with a big garden, and I don't spray anything. And I produce lots of lovely fruits and flowers and vegetables and so on. If you have an outbreak of say aphids on a plant, on a rose, on your runner beans or whatever it might be, if you just leave them, very usually within a few days, insects come to the rescue, those natural enemies, of which there are a huge diversity in a healthy garden if you haven't sprayed too many chemicals around. These are just a few of the insects that will come naturally and consume the aphids. And if they don't, the worst case scenario is that you still have an aphid problem on your roses. Big deal. Is it really doing so much harm? And actually, I would say that if you have a plant in your garden which is repeatedly suffers from insect pest attacks, then you're growing the wrong plant in the wrong place. It's just not happy, it's stressed, and that's why it's suffering from insect attacks. Plant something else instead. Speaking of planting, course, choosing the right flowers is really important. And it's actually slightly odd when you think about it, that there should be flowers that aren't good for insects, because flowers evolved to attract insects in the first place, or hummingbirds or bats or whatever it might be. But we've tinkered with flowers over the years. We've played around producing weird color varieties and mutants with different shaped petals and so on, breeding plants to make them more attractive to people. And often, oh, sorry, that's my phone going off. I hope someone in the family answers it quickly. Bear with me, I'll pause for a second. Oh, there we go. Phew. So these are just a few examples. Among the many ornamental plants that we've created over the years are double varieties, as they're called, plants with extra petals, often mutants where the petals are formed from what used to be the reproductive parts of the flower, the stamens, which would ordinarily produce the pollen, but instead they've mutated into extra petals. So there you have, along the top, roses, cherries, hollyhocks, all of them double varieties, which are completely useless for insects. And along the bottom, the simpler single varieties, which are wonderful for insects. And actually, I think are much more beautiful too. So if you're choosing plants, then just grow the right kinds of plants. Choose the ones that are actually attractive to insects. And there's lots of advice out there. I've made endless YouTube videos about ones that are suitable for growing in a UK garden, which would be relevant to at least some people listening, I should think. So to avoid double varieties, avoid intensively bred annual bedding plants. They're all pretty useless for insects. And grow instead, as a broad kind of rule of thumb, cottage garden and plants and herbs, perennials tend to be much better for pollinators, such as catmint here, a beautiful plant. I've got tons of it in my garden. Now, do bear in mind that even within, say, it's fair to say that catmint or lavender are good or attractive to bees, but actually the different varieties of catmint or lavender or whatever vary quite a lot in just how attractive they are. So, for example, there have been trials comparing different catmint varieties, and Six Hills Giant, which is one of the many commercial varieties, comes out top. It's about 4 times as attractive to pollinators as the worst performing catmint varieties. So even within a single, most lists, most advice on which plants to grow for pollinators don't give you that level of detail, sadly. Speaking of which, I have a new book coming out called Gardening for Bumblebees in April, which will have that information in it. Sorry for the unnecessary book plugs. So lavender, for example, Gros Bleu comes out the best variety for bees and so on. So do think about which varieties you're buying when you're getting hold of plants for pollinators. Try and squeeze in some wildflowers. These are UK wildflowers, so forgive me for showing these, but you're probably aware of wildflowers from your own landscape that would be appropriate to grow in your garden. All flowers were wildflowers once. There's nothing wrong with growing wildflowers in your garden, and there's much to be said for it. They tend to be good for pollinators because they're being wild, they haven't been tinkered with by plant breeders. And also they tend to support other insects. So if you grow native plants, they may well have associated herbivores, such as the caterpillars of butterflies, that will feed upon them, that won't generally feed upon non-native plants that you might grow. Flowering trees are fantastic for pollinators if you have room. So for example, the European lime tree, I planted one in my garden. It's not fully grown yet, but when it's big, it may have enough flowers on it to support maybe 10,000 honeybees at a time. They can be enormously attractive because being 3-dimensional, trees can support an awful lot more flowers than you might pack into the sort of more 2-dimensional area of a flower bed. Loads and loads of lovely flowering trees to choose from. Many of them fruit trees, which obviously then have the added benefit of providing you with your own 0 food miles, 0 packaging fruit. Everybody should squeeze in an apple tree or a plum tree or a pear tree if they've got got room. And because you can get dwarf varieties of fruit trees, you don't actually need very much room at all to grow at least a small one. Do beware when you're buying plants for your garden that most plant nurseries use a lot of chemicals on their plants. This is something we've studied in the UK. We published a paper 3 years ago, which was based on essentially, we went to all the big name garden centres in the south of England, and we bought the plants that they were selling with labels on saying they were bee-friendly plants, or that's the top right there is the logo from the Royal Horticultural Society, perfect for pollinators. 98% of the plants we bought contained pesticides, 75% of them contained insecticides, 70% of them contained neonicotinoid insecticides, which have become notorious for harming bees and other insects. And they're being sold in plants that are claimed to be bee friendly. I think that's pretty outrageous. And I would bet my last dollar that this is also the situation in North America. So do beware, much better to go to an organic nursery if you can find one, or rear plants from seed, or do plant swaps with your friends and neighbours. Speaking of neonicotinoids, you may or may not be aware that so these are chemicals that became notorious, and there's an ongoing argument about whether they should be used by farmers. The European Union banned neonicotinoids in 2018, still widely available in the rest of the world, including North America. But they're also used, they're the main ingredient in many flea treatments that we put on our pets. So you might have a pesticide-free garden, or you think you do, because you don't use any pesticides yourself, you garden organically. But if you have a dog and you treat it against fleas by dripping one of these treatments onto the back of its neck once a month, as your vet will advise you, you could well be inadvertently poisoning your local environment, because the doses that we put on dogs are really quite large. The amount of imidacloprid, one of these neonicotinoids, that you're supposed to drip onto the neck of a medium-sized dog every month prophylactically to prevent it getting fleas, if you follow the advice of your vet, is enough to kill 60 million honeybees. That's about 4 big lorries full of dead honeybees, just in those few drops that you drop onto the back of your dog. They're neurotoxins. They're incredibly poisonous to insects. They're long-lived and they're water soluble. So if your dog goes out in the rain, that stuff's going to all come off in your garden. Or if the dog jumps in a river, it's going to come off in the river. In fact, we have a paper pending showing that nearly 100% of UK rivers are contaminated with these flea treatments that go on to pets, which is really quite concerning. So watch this space for that new publication. Okay, a couple of other little tiny things you might think about for your garden to make it more insect friendly. A very familiar one, everyone's come across bee hotels. Great fun to make a bee hotel, little project to do with the kids. This is a really super ugly one I made a few years ago from a slightly rotten fence post. I just drilled some holes in it, but they do work. Adrian mentioned them earlier and showed some pictures of some rather nicer ones. In the UK, they're really commonly occupied by red mason bees, top right there. In fact, within 20 minutes of drilling the first hole in this post, I had a mason bee coming to investigate. And then we also have leafcutter bees and a whole range of other bees, solitary bees that nest in these holes. You can make much more attractive ones than that, out of bits of bamboo or whatever. As I say, great fun projects to do with children in particular. You don't need much in the way of materials or DIY skills. Or you can buy fancy ones, some of which have windows on the side. And this is one I've got in my garden, where you can see on the right there, the developing bee larvae in their pollen stores, which is really cool, great fun to peek in, and great engagement to try and suck people, especially kids, into being fascinated with insects. One thing which I don't think, as far as I know, no one's ever tried in the US, correct me if I'm wrong, is to make a hoverfly lagoon. This is something that we invented quite recently, or I should say Ellie Rotheray, my PhD student of a few years ago, invented which are little aquatic habitats full of rotting organic matter, rotting leaves, which attract breeding hoverflies of certain species which have aquatic larvae. There's one top center. Common name is a rat-tailed maggot, which doesn't really sell them very well, but they're fascinating little creatures. The long tail is actually a breathing tube, a snorkel, if you like. All you need is, actually, I won't tell you what you need. There's a YouTube video about making a hoverfly lagoon, should you be interested in having these delightful creatures come to live in your garden. Okay, I won't say any more about gardening, because although we could do a lot in our gardens, and I have this fantastic dream of all our gardens being bee friendly, pollinator friendly, insect friendly, wildlife friendly, that's only going to go so far, because the bulk of the landscape is farmed in the UK. 70% of the UK is farmland. And if that remains hostile to life, then insects and wildlife generally are going to struggle no matter what we do in our gardens. But unfortunately, a lot of people accept that this kind of model of industrial farming is the only way we can feed the growing human population in the world. People think that if we don't do this, if we don't use lots of pesticides and have giant fields and huge tractors, that people will starve. I think that that's fundamentally wrong, and that we've gone down completely the wrong avenue, an unsustainable avenue of food production, and that if we carry on farming in this way, people will starve. Precisely because we've done too much intensive farming, because we've ruined the soils, because we've wiped out the bees, and so on. So let me just kind of explain a little bit more about that. And this is moving away from pollinators slightly, but in the big picture, this is actually really relevant to looking after our pollinators. So do we need to do all this super intensive farming? Well, currently we grow about 3 times the amount of food we actually need to feed the world. Nobody is starving because there isn't enough food. They starve because they can't afford it. So we grow about 3 times as many calories as would be required to feed the global population. But a third of them go to waste. Food waste is just shocking, ridiculous. It occurs at all stages, from the farm to us as consumers, buying stuff and then forgetting to eat it and throwing it in the bin. But a third of all that intensive farming is done, and then it's just thrown away. Isn't that crazy? And then roughly another third of all the calories that are grown in crops are fed to animals. Now, I'm not vegetarian, but I think we need to be aware that eating meat is a really inefficient way of feeding people. And if we want to tackle biodiversity collapse and climate change, we need to eat less meat. Maybe see it as a treat, eat it now and again. And particularly we should avoid beef, and worst of all is indoor reared beef fed on crops, on soybeans and corn and so on. If we could all treat meat as something to have a couple of times a week, then it would massively reduce the impact of farming on biodiversity and on climate change. And if we did that, then imagine if we could significantly reduce food waste and significantly reduce meat consumption. We could free up vast areas of land. We could free up perhaps half of the current area of farmland in the world, which is an extraordinary amount of land, and we could rewild it. We could turn it into a giant nature reserve or a series of giant nature reserves. Wouldn't that be amazing? And the only price we have to pay is to eat a bit less meat and find ways not to waste the food that we grow, which surely is not beyond the intelligence of mankind. Another part of the current problem we have with the whole food system, which I think is fundamentally broken, is that we eat too much. Sorry about this picture. It's not a pretty sight, is it? But it's a harsh reality that we have an obesity epidemic based on overconsumption. We grow and eat more food than we need, which has huge environmental costs and huge health costs. In the UK, 27% of adults are obese, and the figure is larger for the US. And one recent estimate suggests that it costs the UK economy £27 billion a year dealing with the health problems associated with overconsumption. So we eat too much and we eat the wrong kinds of foods. We eat lots of pastries and pies and pizza and pasta, calorie-rich food largely based on cereals, and we eat nowhere near enough fruit and vegetables. So what's the alternatives to all this industrial farming? Well, interestingly, there are alternatives that seem to work with nature rather than against it, that seem to be properly sustainable. So we've been studying at University of Sussex. I had a small team looking at local allotments. These are pictures of allotments here. They're quite popular in the UK for people who haven't got enough land in their own. They haven't got a big garden. So they rent a little patch of land to grow vegetables. And these areas, they're extraordinarily productive. A good allotment holder, we've found, can produce about 35 tons per hectare of allotment, 35 tons of mixed fruit and vegetables, 0 food miles, 0 packaging, really super healthy. So if you're unfamiliar with hectares, that's about 17 tons an acre of food. Isn't that amazing? That's way more than a wheat farmer gets with all the chemicals and so on. And at the same time, studies have found that allotments are very rich in biodiversity. In fact, there was a study, another UK study, that recently showed that allotments have richer biodiversity than any other urban habitat, richer even than urban nature reserves. So you can produce food and have nature living in the same place. They don't need to be mutually exclusive in the way that they have generally become in farming. And I think farming is learning from this, or at least there are types of farming, approaches to farming, which use similar principles to allotmenting. Things like, I haven't really got time to do this topic huge justice, but things like agroforestry and permaculture, biodynamic farming, which admittedly has a bit of sort of magic and wizardry thrown in, which isn't terribly scientific, but the basic principles are really good ones. The principles of all of these types of farming are essentially the same. They all aim to be sustainable. And surely the most fundamental requirement of farming is that it has to be sustainable. If the way we are feeding the world is wiping out pollinators that are required to pollinate our crops, then that by definition is not sustainable. And we have to find another way of farming. So these approaches are sustainable. They're focused on looking after the soil and the soil health and soil carbon and soil biodiversity. More broadly, they work with nature rather than against it. They support biodiversity. They encourage pollinators. They encourage natural enemies of crop pests. Farming needs in the long run to find a way to be carbon neutral or carbon negative. Right now, food production contributes 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions. Yet it's perfectly possible to farm in a way that captures carbon into the crop and into the soil. We need to reduce or ideally eliminate pesticide use, which all of these ways of farming do. And they're aimed at producing fruits and vegetables which are really healthy for people, primarily for consumption by local people, seasonal food. And this is something we need to move back to rather than focusing on the current model of industrial production of cereals and oils to produce heavily processed foods that are really bad for us. We've devised a system of agriculture that is destroying the planet and making ourselves ill, which is nuts. And we have to do better. And we can. So to finish off and wrap up, it's a cliche to say, but there is no planet B. There really isn't. This is it. It's amazing, and we need to look after it. And we've done a rubbish job so far. I've just realized that I'm disappearing into darkness. It's getting dark here in the UK at the moment. I'll have to turn the light on in a second. There is no planet B. And there's a real danger that future generations are going to inherit an impoverished planet where most of the natural resources have been destroyed and most of the wonder and beauty has also disappeared. And we have to do better than that, and we can, but maybe we can make a start by looking after the insects that live all around us. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. I hope you could hear me clearly. Thank you.
Awesome. So I'm going to clap for you. Hopefully people can hear me clap. That was awesome. We're getting lots of comments and thanks, and we're going to be getting lots of questions. Everybody, I'll try and do my best to try and transfer some of these questions and notes that I've taken from the chat over to Dave. So be patient with me. There is just like a 10-second delay in the feed too. So just to say, there's just thank yous coming in all over the place, different kinds of comments that I'm sure you can't keep up with, Dave. Andrea says, this is so exciting and motivating. It's really great to hear somebody put something so comprehensive together and not really, it's hard for people to think comprehensively about all the different things that impact pollinators. And that's really one of the big goals of this conference, right? And I think you did a really great job of addressing that. So if folks have specific questions for Dave, feel free and drop them in the chat window there, and I'll reiterate them. So I've got some notes from people. If I see anything else pop up, I'll ask. But here's an interesting one.
Oh, go on.
One of the things that people will often talk about in terms of planting natives here in Colorado is that there's a real trade-off between which resources you're using, water or planting. And so to plant for pollinators does require using water. Do you think there's any kind of ways that we can try to consider the trade-offs between using different resources? So water is really precious here, but so are plants for pollinators.
That's an interesting question. I hope you can hear me. It's not something we tend to have to worry about in the UK, where it rains an awful lot. But presumably native plants are more drought tolerant, less water demanding than the ornamental plants that people might otherwise grow. Certainly in the UK, in the drier parts where there are occasionally water shortages, people are encouraged to grow Mediterranean plants, which are adapted to arid environments and have much lower water requirements. But it's a really difficult thing to do, isn't it? How do you weigh up the environmental impacts of water production versus the benefits of looking after pollinators? It's kind of, apples and pears, that you can't really weigh one against the other very easily. But I guess the answer is to try to minimize the water requirement as best you can by choosing the most drought tolerant but still attractive to bee plants that you can.
Yeah. Great points. I think we're going to have way too many questions than we can get to, but I'll try and get a few of those in there. One of the things that I saw several different comments on is people in the West love meat. And so a lot of your recommendations are really about cultural shifts, right? That eating meat impacts bees and insects, and people don't really think about that. So do you have any recommendations on how you would perceive places like the Western United States, which are big meat eaters, in affecting some kind of cultural shift and their perception of those impacts?
It's really difficult, isn't it? People, we're creatures of habit. Once we've, become grown up with eating meat every day.
The internet's unstable.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Can y'all hear him? Oh, sorry.
I don't know if that's you, Adrian, or me. I hope if it's me, then no one can hear me.
Yeah. Can folks hear? Let's ask in the chat window. Can folks hear me or Dave? Well, continue on. Hopefully it's
I'll just. So actually, I don't have any magic solutions here. How do we change people? I guess we need to wake up to the fact that we can't just carry on doing whatever we fancy. There are too many people on this planet for us to not behave responsibly. Sadly, it would be great if we could all just eat as much meat as we wanted, fly as much as we wanted, do what the heck we wanted. But we just can't, because the resources won't stretch to it. And if you eat meat every day, that means somebody else on the planet somewhere can't eat meat at all, because there just isn't, there aren't the resources. And of course, the reality is that meat consumption in many parts of the world that traditionally ate less meat is moving towards a kind of Western diet of more meat consumption. So we're actually going in completely the wrong direction right now. and how we persuade people to see the link between, you know, what they do when they go to the shops, what they fill their shopping basket with, and the state of the environment, the fact that their children are going to suffer as a result of what they're doing. I guess if we can draw that to people's attention, they might realize that, you know, it's time to change. But it's really difficult, really, really difficult. And sadly, you know, the bulk of the population right now are not strongly engaged in environmental issues. It is changing, but it's not changing really fast enough, I don't think.
Well, and, you know, I think that's a really great segue to one of the other questions which we had, which was, you know, so my parents grew up in the age of Rachel Carson and the environmental movement. And now, you know, people aren't getting so much of their information from books and newspapers, but from social media, right? And so we've had a cultural shift in how people consume information. And so, you know, somebody in the text chat talked about Black Mirror and the episode that was on robotic bees and Black Mirror, that series. And so how do you think we can like have more impact on popular culture? Because that could be a great way to reach out to the next generation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why I go on Twitter and I write the popular books and so on. But although you'd think it would be this amazing mechanism for communicating with huge numbers of people, it's actually really hard because social media operates in these kind of sound chambers, these bubbles, whereby, you know, when I go on to Twitter and tweet something, everyone seems to agree with me. But of course, they're the people that chose to follow me. They're not a random selection of the public. All the people that don't care at all about the environment wouldn't dream of following me on Twitter. So they're in their own little bubble talking about the football or whatever it might be. And not, so how do you break in? How do you pop that kind of bubble and get to the large majority of people that currently are? It's not that they're bad people, they're just unaware of what seem to us to be really important issues, which we firmly believe are vitally important issues, and yet they don't know. And you know, I mean, I guess we obviously have to try what we can and experiment with different ways of reaching out, you know, using different media, art, music, whatever kind of collaborations we can think of to break out from this little kind of circle of like-minded folk that want to save the planet but don't really know how to do it.
Awesome. Yeah. So maybe one more quick question. So somebody was talking about, you know, how impressive the loss of habitat was in the UK, right? I think you mentioned that some 97% of the habitat has been lost there due to agricultural intensification or other reasons. Colorado still has a lot, right? So if you were coming from a country that's lost a lot of its natural habitat, Colorado has still got a whole lot of it left. What would you tell us as Coloradans that we should be doing right now?
Well, I mean, I guess the obvious answer is appreciate that you still have wild areas. You know, I live in a country where we don't have any wild areas at all, really. There's precious little that isn't man-made or strongly man-influenced. And actually, Colorado is amazing because you can go into the mountains and you can go to places which probably have barely changed for hundreds of years, or, you know, it's been barely affected by mankind at all. Of course, things like climate change are starting to have their toll even there because that's universal. But otherwise, you know, be proud and look after what you have. I mean, you know, because it's amazing. I wish we had the same kind of wildlife remaining that you do.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Dave. I'm sure everybody else is so grateful that you're here to talk to us. I'd just like to mention to everybody, feel free and check on the main page under the booth for the tattered cover for some of the titles that we do have for Dave Goulson here. And so right now we'll take a little break. And if you've got questions, continue dropping them into the chat window and we'll see if we can get some answers back to you. But until 10 o'clock, I'll see you guys on the other separate conference pages back for those organized sessions. So thanks so much, everybody, for joining us.
Cheers.
Cheers.